Sarah Carter put her phone on silent at 3 o'clock in the morning. Ahead of her was a short night before the most important day of her life, and she wanted to get at least 4 hours of decent sleep. It was a mistake, not because calls interrupted her rest, but because she woke up on her own at 5 out of a habit ingrained deeper over 7 years than any alarm clock. A surgeon's body lives by its own schedule, and no wedding can cancel it. She lay in the dark, staring at the ceiling. Her dress hung on the closet door cream-colored with a row of tiny buttons down the back. She had spent 3 hours in 2 different boutiques looking for it until Ashley finally pointed and said, "Definitely that one." Sarah had looked in the mirror and decided Ashley was right. The dress made her look taller, brighter, somehow more whole. It was as if 7 years of sleep deprivation and hospital cafeteria food slightly retreated before this simple piece of fine fabric. At 6 a.m., her phone buzzed against the nightstand. She picked it up and glanced at the screen. It was Tara, the charge nurse from the O. Sarah answered before she even had time to think. "Carter," Tara said without any preamble. "Girl, 6 years old, blunt force trauma to the abdomen, ruptured spleen, fell off a swing set at a playground. Hit an exposed piece of rebar. BP is dropping fast. Dr. Evans is in the other wing with a ruptured aorta. He can't step away. The rest are on call or out. You're the only one." Sarah was already sitting up on the edge of the bed. "Are they in transit?" "In transit. 20 minutes out. Prep a no. I'll be there sooner." She hung up, looked at the dress, then got up and walked to the bathroom. Ian was sleeping in the guest room. They had been living together for a year and a half, although his mother, Ella Lehner, considered it inappropriate and never missed a chance to say so. Sarah peeked through the cracked door. He was lying on his back, one arm tossed behind his head, his face peaceful. Handsome, she had to admit. He had always been handsome, tall, neat, the kind of man people turn to look at in restaurants. She looked at him for a second. No more. She didn't wake him. She typed a quick text. "Emergency call. Surgery. I promise I'll be there for the ceremony." Then she left. The morning was a damp, raw April day. She sped through the empty city streets, and her mind was entirely cleared of the dress, the reception venue, and the toasts Ian's best friend, Sean, had prepared. Her mind was filled with a 6-year-old girl with a ruptured spleen and crashing blood pressure. It took up all the space in her head. There was simply no room for anything else. She walked into the ER 18 minutes before the ambulance arrived. Tara was already waiting by the O doors. "Dr. Peterson is prepping anesthesia. We ordered O negative." But as Sarah changed in the locker room, she thought of only one thing: find the source of the bleeding. With a ruptured spleen, every minute counts. A child's blood volume is small. They couldn't delay. The ambulance pulled into the bay at 6:47 a.m. The girl's name was Sophie. Sarah saw her on the gurney, tiny, pale to the point of turning blue, eyes closed, an oxygen mask over her face. Next to her ran a tall man wearing a jacket, thrown hastily over a flannel pajama shirt. He held Sophie's hand and didn't let go until they hit the double doors of the surgical wing. There, a paramedic gently but firmly stopped him. "You can't go any further, sir." The man stopped, watched the doors swing shut and backed up against the wall. Sarah didn't see that part. She was already at the table snapping on her gloves while Dr. Peterson called out the vitals. BP 80/50, heart rate 110. Abdomen is rigid. No bowel sounds. "Let's go," Sarah said. First incision. What happened in that operating room over the next 3.5 hours would be difficult to describe to someone who had never stood there. Not because it was terrifying, though they saw their fair share of horrors, but because it was a specific state of being. You become nothing but hands and brain. Your body ceases to belong to you and becomes a tool. Time loses its normal flow and morphs into a sequence of rapid decisions. This vessel, this suture, this pressure, this dosage. Sarah worked in silence, occasionally throwing short commands to Peterson. He answered just as briefly. Because in a good O, people don't chat. They think the spleen was damaged much more severely than the initial ultrasound had shown. The organ isn't salvageable. Sarah said in an even voice. Blink to me. Prep the tray. Tara nodded. Peterson adjusted something on his monitors. The child lived as long as she lived. Sarah wasn't thinking about time. She knew that somewhere outside the hospital walls, the clock was ticking. That at noon, guests would be gathering at the historic country club venue. Ian would be in his new suit, Eleanor in her inevitable fascinator hat with a vintage brooch, and the tables would be set for the reception. She knew this, and she tucked that knowledge away into a corner of her mind reserved for things she couldn't reach right now. Her father had taught her that discipline, not with words. He was a man of few words but by example. Tom Carter, a shift supervisor at an auto parts factory, woke up at 5 a.m. and went to work even when his back ached, even on the day they buried their neighbor, even when Sarah's mother was in the hospital. Not because he was heartless, but because he understood that your job isn't just about you. It's about the people relying on you. On the operating table lay Sophie, 6 years old, relying entirely on Sarah without even knowing it. At 10:23 a.m., Peterson spoke up. Pressure is stabilizing. 90/60. Sarah exhaled but kept working. At 11:45 a.m. they closed Sophie up. Tara straightened her back over the instrument tray. Peterson pulled down his mask and rubbed his forehead. Good work, document. He said she did the hard work, Sarah replied. Tough kid. She peeled off her gloves and only then looked at the wall clock. 11:48. The ceremony was at noon. She practically jogged into the hallway, pulling her phone from her pocket. The screen was lit up with missed calls. 21 of them. Ian. Ashley. An unknown number. Ian again. Ashley again. Eleanor. The last call from Ian was at 11:32. She hit redial. It rang endlessly, then went to voicemail. She typed out a text. Surgery is done. I'm leaving now. Please hold the ceremony for half an hour. There was no reply. In the locker room, she changed out of her scrubs. Her wedding dress was in her car. She grabbed her things, knowing she had no time to stop by the apartment. She changed right there in the back seat of her sedan in the hospital parking lot. It was slightly absurd, but Sarah had long since stopped worrying about absurdities. When you live in a constant state of no time for 7 years, the absurd becomes normal. She pinned her hair up as best as she could, using the rear-view mirror to apply lipstick. It wasn't the look she had planned. No stylist, no bridesmaids, no quiet morning coffee, but it would have to do. She drove across the city, her phone entirely silent. The venue was an elegant historic estate on the edge of the city. Sarah found a spot in the gravel lot, stepped out, smoothed her dress, and walked toward the grand entrance. People were standing on the front steps, guests dressed up, holding champagne flutes, exuding that specific, slightly hollow cheerfulness that happens when the main event is already over. Sarah slowed her pace. Something was wrong. It was the way they were looking at her. Not with relief. Oh, finally. But with the expression people wear when they know something unpleasant and aren't sure if they should be the ones to tell you. Eleanor walked out of the double doors first. She wore a silver suit and her little hat with the brooch. Everything as planned. Her face, however, was triumphant. Specifically, triumphant, not angry, not confused, but radiating the specific joy of a person who had waited a long time for a moment and finally got it. Look who showed up. She said it wasn't a question. It was a statement. Eleanor, I can explain. It was an emergency operation. A 6-year-old child. You're late, Sarah. She articulated the words slowly, savoring each syllable. Ian waited until 12. Then he made a decision. The right decision, I might add. Sarah stared at her, uncomprehending. What decision? Go inside. See for yourself. Eleanor smiled. Just don't stay long. Don't ruin people's celebration. Sarah walked up the steps. The foyer smelled of expensive floral arrangements and heavy perfume. Soft celebratory jazz drifted from the main ballroom. Someone laughed. Glasses clink. Sarah pushed the heavy oak doors open. Ian was standing by the large bay windows in his new dark gray suit. The one they had picked out together in February. Standing next to him was Ashley. Ashley was wearing a white dress. Sarah froze in the doorway. Ashley Sinclair, her best friend, or what Sarah had considered a best friend for 7 years since their first year of pre-med. Ashley with her parents' trust fund and luxury SUV. Ashley, who used to borrow Sarah's study guides and begged for help passing anatomy. Ashley, who had helped her pick out this very cream-colored dress and said, "Definitely that one." Ashley, who 3 weeks ago had tried on a white gown in the same boutique, frowned and said it just wasn't her style. Sarah had nodded and hadn't thought about it again. The white dress was exactly her style. Exactly. The officiant was closing a leather-bound book. Sarah couldn't quite process it at first. Rings were on their fingers. The guests with their champagne flutes, Ian's friends, his corporate colleagues, a few mutual acquaintances were looking at the newcomer with varying degrees of intense awkwardness. Some whispering frantically behind their glasses. Ian saw her. A flicker of something crossed his face. Not regret, more like the relief of a man who realized he wouldn't have to explain himself over the phone later. "Sarah," he said. "I waited until 12:30, she said. Her voice was remarkably steady. She was surprised by how steady it sounded. "Sarah, be reasonable. There were 120 guests here. You couldn't wait another 30 minutes. It wasn't 3 hours of me running late. I was operating on a dying child. You are always operating on somebody." He said it without malice, almost with exhaustion. "You're always operating or on call or not picking up the phone or coming home in the middle of the night. Sarah, I've lived in this schedule for 3 years. I'm tired." Ashley stood next to him, looking off to the side, wearing that white dress, and now looking at her. Sarah suddenly remembered what Ashley had said 3 months ago. "It must be so hard for Ian with your schedule, right?" She had said it with sympathy, with that special brand of care that Sarah mistook for friendship. "He needs someone around when you're not there." Sarah had agreed back then and later asked Ian if everything was okay. Ian had said, "Everything is fine." Everything was fine. "How long?" Sarah asked. Ashley finally looked at her. There was no shame in her eyes. It was something else, almost defiant. "Sarah. It's complicated to explain." "And don't." Eleanor appeared over Sarah's shoulder. She had slipped in silently, as if knowing she'd be needed right at this moment. "Sarah, sweetie, why are you just standing there? You see the situation. Get out of here and don't ruin the party." She let out a small laugh, not loud, but enough that several guests turned their heads. Sarah looked at her, then at Ian, then at Ashley in the white dress. For 7 years, she hadn't slept properly. For 7 years, she ate hospital, cafeteria, food, and worked as a nurse's aide during her freshman year just to afford rent. For 7 years, she woke up at 5 a.m., went to bed past midnight, called her mom once a week briefly because there was no time, postponed vacations, rescheduled weekends, and once spent 28 straight hours on her feet, taking the subway home clinging to a pole so she wouldn't collapse from exhaustion. This morning, she had saved a 6-year-old girl's life. And now, she stood in the doorway of a country club in a cream-colored dress with tiny buttons. Alone, in front of people who looked at her with pity or gloating, depending on whose side they were on, she turned around and walked toward the exit. In the wide glass doors leading out to the pillared steps stood a tall man in a jacket thrown hastily over a flannel shirt. He was looking at her, and she recognized him instantly. The ER hallway, the wall, the tightly clasped hands. Sophie's father. He recognized her too. "You're here," he said. It wasn't a question. He stated it like an unexpected fact. "I'm here." She wasn't entirely sure what was happening anymore. Just moments ago, Eleanor had laughed behind her back. Ashley was in a white dress and Ian was talking about schedules. It was all real, yet incredibly surreal, like a scene from someone else's movie. The man looked at her for a few seconds, then glanced past her. Through the glass, he saw the champagne glasses, the dressed-up crowd, and the blur of Ashley's white dress. He understood something. Not everything, but enough. "Let's get out of here," he said. Sarah looked at him. "Where anywhere?" He paused. "Just not here," she thought for a second, then nodded. They walked down the steps. The April air was chilly and smelled of rain that hadn't quite started yet. A black SUV, expensive but dusted with road dirt, as if it had been driven a long way in a hurry, idled by the curb. He opened the passenger door for her. "Mark," he said. "Mark Davis." "Sarah," she replied. "Carter, I know," he said. "Sophie will never let me forget it." Sarah almost smiled. She got into the car, but before telling what happened next, it's necessary to tell what happened before, because no story truly begins in the moment it seems to. It begins earlier, sometimes much earlier. Sarah Carter was born in a small town a few hours outside of Chicago. Her father was a shift foreman at a manufacturing plant. Her mother, Nancy, was a high school English teacher, the kind of teacher all the kids were slightly terrified of at first, but ended up loving. The family was ordinary, not poor, not rich, the kind of family that treats money with respect because it is earned through hard labor. They didn't squander it, and they didn't complain. From childhood, Sarah was wired differently than most of her classmates. Not necessarily smarter, though she was very bright, just different. She couldn't leave things halfway done. If she started a book, she finished it. If she started a puzzle, she completed it, even if the last 20 pieces were the exact same shade of blue and took an eternity. Her father sometimes looked at her with an expression that said he recognized something of himself in her. She decided to go into medicine in middle school after the neighbor's dog died in her arms. A mutt named Buster, whom she had been trying to treat for something she couldn't even remember what. Now, using home remedies and advice from an old veterinary encyclopedia she found in the garage. The dog didn't die from the illness. He died because Sarah didn't know what to do. It was a sharp, precise feeling. I didn't know. She never wanted to not know again. She chose medicine not out of romanticized ideals. She understood it was a long, grueling road, but she had no other way of becoming the person who knew what to do. She got into a pre-med program on a full merit scholarship. The competition was brutal, but she scored well above the cutoff. Her mother cried. Her father shook her hand, a firm, brief working man's handshake. College life was exactly what you'd expect. Cramped dorms, communal showers down the hall. Someone always microwaving something. Questionable at midnight. Sarah quickly learned to sleep through any noise and eat at any hour. By her sophomore year, she was working nights as a CNA, 3 night shifts a week. It was tough to balance with labs and exams, but it paid for real food and textbooks instead of forcing her to rely solely on the campus library reserves. She met Ashley Sinclair freshman year. Ashley was from a wealthy family, lived in an off-campus luxury apartment, and drove to class in a car her parents bought her. She was fun, breezy, the kind of girl who just knew how to make things around her pleasant. Initially, Sarah kept her distance, instinctively sensing the disparity in their starting lines. But Ashley approached her during the 3rd week, asked to borrow her biochemistry notes, and then dragged her to the campus coffee shop. Somehow, they just started hanging out. Ashley seemed like a good friend. Sarah believed it for a long time. Ashley was generous, paying for drinks without tracking who owed what, capable of making Sarah laugh during Hell Week, and a good listener, or at least good at pretending to be. She said the right things. "You're going to ace this. You're smarter than all of them." Sarah accepted it as genuine, never realizing that behind Ashley's words lay a faint shadow. Not quite envy, but something akin to it. Something that made her ask about Sarah's exam scores immediately, or beg for explanations of concepts she already understood. She praised Sarah just a little too loudly in a way that masked her underlying desire to be the one in the spotlight. Sarah didn't notice. She didn't have the time to. She just kept moving forward semester after semester. Anatomy, physiology, pathology, surgery, clinicals, rotations, nights hunched over books. After med school came her surgical residency. The match process was brutal, but she landed a spot at a top Chicago hospital. By then, Ashley had taken an administrative job at the same hospital. Seemed convenient, a familiar face nearby. Sarah met Ian through Ashley. It was a hospital charity gala. Ashley brought him over and said, "A friend from the corporate world. Just introduce yourselves." Tall, wearing a tailored suit. He said all the right things. Being a surgeon is an incredible responsibility. I've always admired people who can actually fix things with their hands. Sarah looked at him and thought, he's handsome. Maybe she was just tired. Tired of the loneliness, of never having time, of going years without anyone truly being there for her. She called him first, then he called her. They started dating. Ian never asked about her surgeries. He never asked how her day in the O went, but he was always ready to try a new restaurant and knew how to pick a good wine. He introduced her to his friends like this. This is Sarah. She's a surgeon. He said it with a certain pride, like showing off a status symbol, a checked box on his life plan. Sarah noticed but convinced herself she was overthinking it. He was just reserved, she reasoned. Not great at talking about feelings. His mother, Ella Lehner, made her opinion of Sarah perfectly clear from day one. Nothing good. A doctor, she had said during their second meeting, examining Sarah with that specific polite coldness that is worse than outright rudeness. It's a noble calling, of course, but the salaries at those public hospitals. I work at a private research hospital, Sarah said evenly. Still, Eleanor pursed her lips. Ian is used to a certain lifestyle. Ian's lifestyle was funded by Ian and quite well. He was a commercial director for a large real estate development firm. But Eleanor spoke of him as if he were a fragile artifact requiring delicate handling. Sarah stayed quiet. Ian stayed quiet. This became their default mode around Eleanor. Stay silent and wait for her to finish talking. 3 years. For 3 years, Sarah took call, operated, ran on fumes and came home midnight. For 3 years, Ian said, everything's fine, and went to corporate mixers. For 3 years, Ashley asked with deep sympathy, how do you even manage? He barely sees you for weeks at a time. And Sarah would reply with something about duty and calling. And Ashley would nod and say, you're amazing. Everything was basically as it always had been. Ian proposed in November. He brought out a velvet box, sat across from her and said, marry me. No flowery speeches. Sarah said, yes. Also without much fanfare. To both of them it felt like the logical next step, or at least it felt that way to Sarah. They set the date for April. Eleanor took over the planning with an enthusiasm Sarah initially mistook for goodwill. The venue, the menu, the floral arrangements, everything was decided without Sarah's input, unobtrusively but firmly. Sarah didn't argue. She didn't have the time to argue. Ashley helped with the dress. Now, sitting in the passenger seat of Mark Davis's SUV, watching the April rain mist over the city streets, Sarah thought about the things she should have noticed long ago. It wasn't that the red flags weren't there. She just hadn't looked in that direction. She had kept her eyes fixed straight ahead on the oar, on the textbooks, on the next shift. She didn't know how to use her peripheral vision. Or maybe she just hadn't wanted to. The car pulled up to a quiet old-school diner, the kind with vinyl booths and coffee served in thick ceramic mugs. Coffee? Mark asked. Yes, Sarah said. They went inside and slid into a booth by the window. Mark ordered and then sat in silence for a while. It wasn't awkward. He just seemed like a man who knew how to be quiet without feeling the need to fill the space. Then he said, I drove out there to thank you. I didn't realize you were at your own wedding. I went there to get married. Sarah replied. I didn't realize it wouldn't happen. He looked at her. Sophie's in the ICU. He said, condition is stable. Called on the drive over. They told me you did good work. She's a tough kid. He paused. She gets that from her mom. Sarah didn't ask what he meant. Some things don't require explanation. You can hear it in the way a person says the words. The waitress brought their coffee. Sarah wrapped her hands around the mug. Her fingers were trembling slightly. She only just noticed it. It wasn't from the cold. It was the adrenaline finally leaving her system after the surgery. It always happened when the tension broke. Mark looked at her hands but didn't say anything. Do you have a place to stay? He asked suddenly. Serious. Unsmiling. If you need it, my apartment in the city is empty. Sarah looked up at him. He held her gaze and the corners of his eyes crinkled just slightly. Not a joke, almost a smile. "Okay," Sarah said. "I'll keep it in mind." Outside, the rain began to fall harder. A fine, persistent Midwest spring rain that felt like a reminder that the seasons would do whatever they pleased. Sarah drank her coffee and thought about how she needed to call her mom. Nancy Carter was sitting at home anxious. Sarah hadn't had time to explain anything that morning. She needed to call and say, "Mom, everything is fine. The little girl is alive and I'm fine too." It was the truth. Strange, unexpected, slightly deafening, but the truth. Mark drove her to her apartment at 2:30. They didn't talk on the way. Not because they had nothing to say, but because both were exhausted. Mark was exhausted the way people are. After spending hours terrified while trying not to show it against the hospital wall, in the car on the way to the venue, and now in the car with her, Sarah was exhausted in a different way from operating since dawn and then living through whatever that was in the ballroom with the jazz music and champagne flutes. It was a different kind of fatigue, but it stole your words all the same. He knew her address. She had given it to him outside the diner, a mid-rise brick building a few blocks behind the hospital. He parked by the entrance and left the engine running, sensing she would walk in alone without needing an escort. "Thank you," Sarah said. "For what?" "Driving you away," she nodded. "I'll check on Sophie tomorrow," she added. "Normally I like to follow up post-op. It's not an obligation. Just stop by." He said she'll be glad to see you. Sarah got out of the car, took the elevator up to the 3rd floor, and unlocked the door. She walked into the quiet entryway. Ian's dress shoes were lined up neatly by the door. Then she remembered Ian didn't live here anymore, or rather, she didn't know what to call the situation. They rented the apartment together, but the lease was in Ian's name. That meant she had a lot of logistics to figure out, but not today. Today, she had no energy to think about anything. She took off the cream dress with the tiny buttons and hung it carefully on a hanger, a habit left over from her broke college days. "Take care of your things." Then she lay down on top of the bedspread. She was asleep in a minute. She woke up at 6 p.m. to her phone ringing. It was her mom, Sarah. NY's voice was steady, but there was a forced effort behind the steadiness. "Tell me, how do you know?" Aunt Susan called. Her niece was a guest. Sarah was silent for a moment, then told her the whole story briefly without unnecessary details. Just the facts. The surgery arriving late. Ian marrying Ashley leaving. Nancy listened in silence. When Sarah finished, the line was quiet for several seconds. "The little girl survived?" Her mother asked. "Yes, she's stable." "Good." Another pause. "Mom, aren't you going to say anything else?" "What is there to say?" Nancy stated it as a fact, not a question. "You did the right thing." "Both things. The surgery and walking out." "That wasn't one thing. It was two." "It was the same thing." Her mother paused. "Are you coming home?" "Not right now. Later. I have some things to sort out here." "Sort them out." "I'm not going anywhere." It was the longest conversation Nancy Carter had ever had regarding her daughter's romantic life. She was an English teacher. She knew how to speak eloquently and at length, but only about things that warranted eloquent speeches. On other matters, she stayed quiet or said only what was strictly necessary. Sarah knew this, and she appreciated it. The next day, Sarah called a legal clinic. The marriage situation turned out to be legally messy, but emotionally clear. The officiant had performed a symbolic ceremony for Ian and Ashley at 12:41 p.m. It wasn't legally binding yet. Since the marriage license still had Sarah's name on it, they would have to reapply at the county clerk. But in front of 120 guests, the message was final. However, the apartment they shared was leased under Ian's name. Sarah needed to move out, and the sooner the better. She called Ian that afternoon. The conversation was brief. "Sarah, I want to explain." "You don't need to. I just need to get my things when you aren't home." "I'm at work tomorrow from 10 to 2. "Fine." She didn't have much. 2 suitcases, a couple of heavy-duty trash bags stuffed with winter clothes, a box of medical textbooks, and her work bag. She drove it all over to her colleague Natalie's place. Natalie, a senior scrub nurse who lived alone in a 2-bedroom apartment, had been telling her for months, "If you ever need it, the spare room is yours." Natalie opened the door, looked at the 2 suitcases and the box, and just said, "Want a glass of wine, please?" Sarah answered. They drank wine, and Natalie asked no questions. It was the best thing anyone could have done for her that evening. The hospital greeted her the next morning as it always did. The smell of antiseptic, the hum of the elevators, and the voice of Tara jogging past with a clipboard. "Carter, they're waiting for you in room 3. Not how are you, not we heard, just they're waiting." It was the right tone. Sarah appreciated it. In room 3 lay Sophie. She was tiny, even for a 6-year-old, skinny, with dark circles under her eyes and an 4 in the back of her hand. But her eyes were open. And when Sarah walked in, she lifted her head from the pillow. "Are you her?" Sophie asked. "I am," Sarah said. "Are you the lady who fixed my tummy?" Something like that. Sophie was silent for a moment, studying her with that intense seriousness only found in small children and very old people. "Were you scared?" "I wasn't," Sarah answered honestly. "Me neither." Sophie thought about it, but then I fell asleep and stopped being anything. Mark was sitting in the corner of the room, not right by the bed, but off to the side on a chair holding his phone. He looked up when Sarah walked in and stood. "Good morning." "Good morning." Sarah approached the bed and ran through her checks. The surgical site, temperature, skin color, everything looked good. As good as it could look on post-op day 3 for a surgery like this. "You've got a tough kid here," she said to Mark. "She gets it from her mom," he repeated, just as he had at the diner. This time Sarah asked, "How long?" 3 years, he said it simply. Without melodrama. Just a fact that had become part of his landscape. Sarah nodded. She didn't push. "Sophie," she said, turning back. "Did you eat your oatmeal today?" Sophie scrunched her nose. "Tastes bad. Hospital oatmeal is a law of nature. It's always bad. Home it's good. Dad makes it with raisins." "That's because home isn't a hospital." Sophie considered this. "When do I go home?" "If you behave in a few days." "I always behave." Mark cleared his throat softly. Sophie shot him a reproachful look. "Almost always." She corrected herself. Sarah made her notes in the chart, said goodbye and walked out into the hallway. Mark followed her out. "Hold on a second," he said. She stopped. He leaned against the wall just like he had that first morning, though his hands weren't tightly clasped anymore. He just stood there looking at her. "I want to thank you properly," he said. "It's important to me, not just the standard thank you and not money. I know money would be inappropriate." Sarah watched him. He really did understand. She could tell. "Then what?" "I don't know yet." He paused. "But I'll think of something." She almost smiled. "All right." She walked down the corridor. He watched her go. She didn't turn around, but somehow she knew it for a fact. The following days settled into a routine. Sarah worked. She needed to find an apartment. Natalie's spare room was temporary and they both knew it. The chief medical officer, Dr. Chambers, called her into his office on the 4th day. He mentioned he had heard about certain circumstances likely from Tara, who seemed to be the hospital's primary intelligence network. He didn't ask questions. He just said, "Carter, I know a property manager for a building down the street. A 1-bedroom opens up in 2 weeks. If you need it, say the word." Sarah said the word. It was done quietly without fuss. Just someone who had the power to help actually helping. Sarah noticed things like that. Sophie was recovering faster than expected. On day 4, she was sitting up in bed demanding crayons. On day 4, she was walking around the room holding onto the wall giving running commentary on everything she saw out the window. On day 5, Mark brought her a sketchbook and markers, and she immediately started drawing, her tongue sticking out in concentration. Sarah stopped by every day. Strictly speaking, it wasn't necessary. Sophie was under the care of the attending pediatrician and the on-call surgical team, but Sarah went anyway. At first, she told herself she was checking the incision. Then she stopped trying to justify it. Mark was there every time. He worked from the room, taking calls, typing on his laptop, signing printed documents. Sarah realized he was handling his daughter entirely on his own without nannies or extended family. He did it calmly without complaining, just accepting it as a given. Dropping off in the morning, picking up in the evening, sitting by her side in the middle of the day. On the 5th day, he followed her out into the hallway again. "I heard you're looking for an apartment." Sarah stopped. "How?" "Tara mentioned it." Tara mentions a lot of things. The corners of his eyes crinkled again. "I have an empty condo 2 blocks from here. I don't live there. Sophie and I live in a house out in the suburbs. I can rent it to you at a fair rate." Sarah looked at him. "That would be weird." She said, "Why?" "Because you're the father of my patient." "Former patient," he corrected. "She's being discharged soon." "Still weird." "Dr. Carter," he said, using her formal title in a way that sounded entirely informal, as if he had known her a long time and finally got around to saying it. "I'm offering a good apartment at a normal price. I'm not trying to obligate you to anything. If it makes you uncomfortable, say the word and I'll drop it." Sarah thought for a second. "Can I see it?" "Tomorrow, whenever you're free." The apartment was nice. 2nd floor, 2 bedrooms, not the 1 bedroom she had expected, and the rent was extremely reasonable. It was bright, dry, and recently updated. In the 2nd bedroom stood a large bookshelf, mostly empty except for a few heavy volumes on structural engineering on the bottom shelf. "You're an engineer?" Sarah asked. "Architectural engineer. I run my own firm." "Why are these books still here?" "Forgot to pack them when I moved." He said it casually without trying to steer the conversation back to himself. Sarah noticed that about him. "Fast," he answered. If not, he didn't volunteer stories about how great he was. It was refreshing. Ian, for example, had always found a way to talk about his deals without waiting to be asked. "I'll take it," Sarah said. 10 days after that April Friday, she moved in. She still didn't have much stuff. 2 suitcases, a box of books, a bag. But now it was hers, even if it was rented. She unpacked her medical texts. She had more than would fit on 1 shelf and had to buy a 2nd bookcase from Target. She didn't touch the structural engineering books. Sophie was discharged on day 6. Sarah was in surgery and found out later from Tara, who naturally knew everything. The Davis family left. "The kid said to tell you thank you and that she's going to draw a portrait of you." "Of me?" Sarah asked. "Yeah, she asked Dr. Davis how to spell your name." Sarah thought about that for the rest of her shift. Mark called that evening. "Sophie's home," he said. "Feeling good. Demanded her crayons the minute we walked in." "That's a good sign." Was. "Dr. Carter. She wants to give you something." "The drawing. Can I drop it by?" "You can," Sarah said. "But I'd rather come to you if you don't mind. I want to check on her myself post-discharge tomorrow." Then the next evening, she drove out to the suburbs. They lived in a real house, not an apartment, a modest, solid place with a large yard and an old apple tree near the porch. As she drove, Sarah thought about how recently she had been driving to a very different location for a very different reason. That drive felt like a lifetime ago. Even though it had been less than 2 weeks, Sophie burst out onto the porch in pink bear pajamas before Sarah even parked the car, holding a piece of paper. "I drew it," she yelled. "Dad, don't let her leave until she looks." "Sophie, you're in your pajamas," Mark said, stepping out behind her. "So it's warm." It wasn't particularly warm. May had just begun, and the Chicago wind still had teeth. But Mark opted not to argue. He stood on the porch watching his daughter with the kind of expression that tells you a man is entirely happy, even if he'd never say it out loud. Sarah took the drawing. It showed 2 stick figures, one big, one small, and something between them that looked like a cross between a sun and a heart. Written below in wobbly block letters. "Dr. Sarah and me." "It's beautiful," Sarah said. "That's you," Sophie explained. "I can't draw hands right yet, so you only have 4 fingers and your hair is crazy, but it's definitely you. I see the resemblance. And this is me." Sophie pointed to the smaller figure. "I'm crooked too, but that's okay." "It's perfectly okay," Sarah agreed. "Come inside," Mark said. I made coffee. The inside of the house was exactly what Sarah had imagined. Practical, uncluttered, but deeply lived in. Books on shelves. Sophie's drawings magnetized to the fridge. A large drafting table near the window covered in blueprints. Mark pushed the blueprints aside and set down mugs. Sophie climbed onto the sofa, pulled a fleece blanket over herself, and turned on a cartoon with the businesslike demeanor of someone who had completed her tasks for the day and was now clocking out. "How is she really?" Mark asked quietly as Sophie stared at the screen. "She's doing great," Sarah said. "A splenectomy in childhood is serious. You'll need to watch her immune system. Special vaccine schedule. I'll print out a guide for you. But kids bounce back much better than adults. They compensate well." He listened intently. He wasn't just nodding. He was absorbing the information. "Any questions?" she asked. "One," he said. "Not medical." Sarah looked at him. "How are you?" She hadn't expected the question. Or rather, she hadn't expected him to ask it so directly without any build-up. "Fine," she answered. "That's not an answer. It's the only one I have right now." He nodded and didn't push. "The condo working out?" "Yes, thank you. Had to buy another bookshelf." "Makes sense. Not a lot of built-ins." They sat in silence. Outside, the evening sky darkened slowly. The reluctant sunset of early May. On the couch, Sophie fell asleep right in the middle of her cartoon. She went quiet, curled up on her side under the blanket, the TV flickering light into the empty room. Mark stood up, turned off the TV, tucked the blanket around her, and sat back down at the table. "She falls asleep everywhere," he said, "like a cat. A good trait to have." Sarah finished her coffee. "I should go," she said. "Course." He walked her to the front door. As she put on her jacket, she turned around. "Mark. Thanks for the coffee." He looked at her. "Come back sometime. Sophie will be thrilled." It sounded simple, devoid of any heavy subtext. Or maybe there was a light subtext she could ignore if she chose to. Sarah wasn't sure what she wanted to do with it yet. "I will," she said and walked out. While Sarah was adapting to her new apartment and her new rhythm of life, other events were unfolding in another part of the city. Events she didn't know about immediately, but learned of later in fragments from different people. Ian and Ashley had an official wedding reception 3 weeks after the courthouse debacle. Eleanor, by all accounts, was in her element. The reception was held at the exact same historic venue in the ballroom Ian had already paid for. The paperwork was simply transferred to the new bride. Sarah heard this from Natalie, who heard it from Tara, who heard it from an unnamed source no one ever openly questioned. Sarah listened, nodded, and asked if there was any coffee left in the break room. Ashley called her a month later. "Sarah, I want to explain." Ashley Clear's throat started. "You don't need to," Sarah said. "No, I do. You have to understand it wasn't a malicious thing against you, Ian. And Ashley, I'm not angry." Sarah said it evenly because it was true. "My only regret is that I didn't see what everyone else apparently saw. That wasn't very smart of me." "Sarah, it wasn't your fault." "I didn't say it was my fault. I said it wasn't smart. Those are different things." "Was. Ashley, we have nothing to talk about. Not because I hate you, but because there's simply nothing left to say." She hung up. The phone was quiet for a few seconds. Then a text came in from Mark. "Sophie wants to know if you like cherries. She claims this is vital for science." Sarah stared at the screen, then typed back, "I do for science." 2 minutes later, a reply. She says, "Thank you. The scientific inquiry is concluded." Sarah put the phone in her pocket, waited a moment, then took it out again and texted, "How is Sophie?" Asked to go outside today for the first time. We did 20 minutes on the porch swing. She's outraged it wasn't longer. That's good progress. Quoted you. She said, "Dad, good progress is staying outside as long as I want. 20 minutes is an insult." Sarah almost laughed out loud. May rolled into June. Sarah worked her usual heavy hours, but without complaint. The hospital was a good one. Dr. Chambers ran a tight ship. The equipment was top tier, and the caseload was never boring. After 7 years of exhaustion where she couldn't even see the light at the end of the tunnel, Just working in a functioning environment felt like a luxury. In the evenings, she read cooked simple meals, actual meals, not cafeteria takeout. And occasionally called her mom. Nancy never asked about Ian, not directly, not indirectly. She asked about the hospital, the apartment, whether the windows were drafty. It was her way of caring. About once a week, a text would come from Mark, almost always about Sophie. Sophie just announced that when she grows up, she wants to be a surgeon. I don't know who I should be more afraid of. Sophie drew another portrait. You have 5 fingers now. Progress. Sophie wants to know when you're coming over. I tried to explain that doctors have more important things to do than answer her questions. She disagrees. Sarah replied in the same tone. Sometimes she added something of her own, a funny story from her shift, a comment on the weather. Once she texted that she had read a few pages of his structural engineering book. The reply came fast. Which one? She described the cover. That's an outdated edition. Building codes have changed, but the physics are the same. Then he sent another message. Did you really read it? Most people think it's mind-numbing. Most people don't operate. We use similar logic. First you understand the structure, then you find the weak point. A long pause then. Yeah, exactly. It was their first conversation that wasn't strictly about Sophie. Sarah only realized it when she scrolled back through the texts before bed. In mid-June, she drove out to see them again, not for a medical checkup. Sophie had called her directly. It was unexpected she had somehow gotten Sarah's number from Mark's phone and dialed it with her tiny thumb. Hello, Sophie said, sounding like a seasoned negotiator. It's Sophie. Dad and I are going to the farmer's market for cherries. You said you liked them. Are you coming? Sarah looked at her watch. Sunday 11 a.m. She was off call. I'll come, she said. But, Dad, she's coming. Sophie yelled away from the receiver. Then back to Sarah. We'll pick you up at noon. Dad says you can say no if you're busy, but I told him you aren't. I'm not saying no. Smart choice, Sophie approved and hung up. The farmer's market was out in the county. A sprawling summer setup with wooden stalls, canvas tents, and crates of early fruit and vegetables. Sophie walked through the aisles with the air of an experienced inspector. She poked the berries, sniffed the peaches, and interrogated the vendors with a bluntness that would be rude in an adult, but was just pure curiosity from a 6-year-old. These are sweeter, she announced at the 3rd cherry stand. Dad, we're buying here. You sure? I conducted a scientific experiment. Mark looked at Sarah. Sarah nodded solemnly. Science is science. They bought 3 pounds of cherries and a basket of strawberries. Sophie insisted on the strawberries, claiming they were a necessary control group for her experiment. On the drive back, Sophie fell asleep in the back seat, her mouth slightly open, clutching the bag of cherries to her chest. Mark turned down the radio. Sarah looked out the window. Farm fields, windbreaks, and small rural towns blurred past. When was the last time you just drove somewhere without being in a hurry? Mark asked. Sarah thought about it. I can't remember. Me neither. Outside, they passed a leaning wooden fence with a white cat sunbathing on a post. Tell me about Irene, Sarah said. She didn't know why she asked. Maybe because he had said she gets it from her mom twice, making it clear she was important. Or maybe because there wasn't a single photograph of Irene in the suburban house, and that absence was its own kind of answer, but an incomplete one. Mark stayed quiet for a long moment, not out of offense, but finding the right words. She was an architect, he finally said. We met on a job site. She came with the client. I was doing the structural loads. We argued for 3 hours about whether the framing could support her idea for a cantilevered panoramic window. Did it? Did. She was right. She was almost always right. It was simultaneously amazing and incredibly infuriating. Sarah almost smiled. Sophie takes after her. Yeah, he said it simply without melodrama. But there was a weight to the word that told her not to push further. Sophie looks just like her. Sarah nodded and didn't ask anything else. Back at the house, Mark carefully carried the sleeping Sophie to the couch and covered her with a fleece blanket. Sarah put the kettle on. Happened naturally. Not because she was trying to play house, but because the kettle was right there, and her hands moved before her brain told them to stop. Mark walked into the kitchen, saw the kettle on the stove, and didn't say anything. He just sat at the table. Sarah pulled 2 mugs from the cabinet. She already remembered where they were kept. "Do you remember what you said to me on that first day?" she asked. "Which part about the dress?" He looked at her. "Remember. Were you serious, or were you just trying to snap me out of it?" The silence stretched. It wasn't awkward. It felt like he was weighing his answer carefully. "Both," he finally said. Sarah nodded and poured the boiling water. "Good," she said. "I just wanted to be sure." "Are you sure?" They drank their coffee. From the living room came the steady sound of Sophie's breathing. Outside, the wind rustled the leaves of the old apple tree. Sarah left around 7 in the evening. At the door, Mark said, "You don't just have to come over for medical checkups." "I didn't come for a medical checkup today." "I know," he said. "I just wanted to say it out loud." The summer passed. They saw each other about once every 2 weeks. Sometimes she drove out to the suburbs. After the cherries came blueberries. Then a trip to an apple orchard where Sophie picked with such fierce determination that Mark had to carefully inspect every single apple before putting it in the basket. Sometimes they met in the city at a cafe, a park, and once at a massive used book fair where Sophie dragged them both around and emerged with 3 chapter books and the firm conviction that they should have bought the rest of the tables, too. Sarah noticed how the space between her and Mark was changing slowly, almost imperceptibly, like the light in a room shifting as a cloud moves past the sun. Nothing abrupt, just the sudden realization that things were brighter. He didn't rush her, didn't say too much, but he started calling instead of texting. At first it was with a specific reason, then just to talk. In the evenings after Sophie was asleep, they would talk for 20 or 30 minutes about nothing in particular. His firm, her hospital, a book she was reading, Sophie demanding they adopt a dog with a strong personality. His voice was calm and deep, and Sarah caught herself looking forward to those calls. It was a new feeling. With Ian, she had never waited for a call. Ian called when he called, and that was that. Now she realized that the lack of anticipation had been its own kind of answer. She just hadn't known how to read it. In late August, Nancy called. She got straight to the point as always. "Sarah, I'm coming to visit." "Bae, when?" "Just for the weekend. I want to see how you're settled." "I'm settled fine." "I want to see that for myself," her mother said. "Unless you're forbidding me, I'm not." Nancy arrived on a Friday evening with a single travel bag and the demeanor of a woman who wasn't intimidated by a long drive. She walked into the apartment, looked around methodically the way she graded essays, nodded at the geranium on the windowsill and said, "You need to move that plant to the east window." "Needs morning sun." "It is in the east window, Mom." "Then it's fine." Nancy walked through the rooms and stopped at the bookcase. "Are these engineering books?" "Yours." "Well." The landlord left them behind. Nancy gave her a short, penetrating look, the kind that meant she understood exactly what was going on and had decided not to ask any further questions. It was her highest form of tact. She stayed for 3 days. They went grocery shopping, cooked together and watched TV in the evenings. On the second night her mother said, "You've changed." "How?" "I don't know the right word for it." Nancy thought about it. "Lighter, maybe. Like you were carrying something heavy for a long time and you finally put it down." Sarah stayed quiet. "That's a good thing," her mother added. "You're supposed to put heavy things down when they don't belong to you." On the 3rd day, right before leaving, she asked the only direct question of the trip. "Is there someone?" Sarah didn't answer immediately. "Maybe. I'm not entirely sure yet." Nancy nodded and left it at that. In September, Sophie started 1st grade. This was treated as an event of national importance, at least judging by Sophie's expression the day she showed Sarah her new backpack and first-day outfit. The backpack was bright red with a giant cartoon cat on it. "The cat is critical," Sophie explained. "Without the cat, it's just a bag." "Agreed," Sarah said. "Are you coming to drop off on the first day?" Sarah looked at Mark. He was looking away, inspecting the coat rack again. But she knew what that meant. Now he was listening, and her answer mattered to him. I'll be there, Sarah said. The 1st of September was a warm, golden late summer morning. Sarah requested the morning off without giving a reason. Dr. Chambers approved it without asking, though he probably guessed. The elementary school courtyard was chaotic. Parents milling about, holding coffee cups, taking photos, kids showing off new shoes. Sophie held Sarah's hand with her left and Mark's hand with her right, marching between them with the aura of a CEO arriving at a board meeting. Are you going to wait for me after? Sophie asked. We'll be here, Mark said. Both of you. Both of us. Sarah confirmed. Sophie nodded satisfied. As the bell rang, she let go of their hands, hitched the red cat backpack higher on her shoulders, and marched through the double glass doors. They stood side by side on the sidewalk. As the crowd of parents began to thin out, it grew quieter. Thank you for coming, Mark said. I promised I would. I know. He paused. You always do what you promise. Sarah looked at him. Is that a bad thing? It's a very good thing, he said. Just rare. They walked over to a wooden bench near the playground to wait out the first hour of orientation. A few feet away, a younger dad was rocking a toddler in a stroller. Ordinary morning, ordinary life, Mark, Sarah said. You ever think about what happens next? He didn't answer right away. He stared out at the schoolyard at the American flag flapping lightly on the flagpole at the late summer sky. I used to, he finally said, and I realized I had no idea what it was supposed to look like. For 3 years I didn't think about it at all. I figured there was no point. Had Sophie. Had the firm. And that was enough. He turned to face her. And then you showed up. Sarah didn't say anything. Not because you saved Sophie, he added. Or rather not just because of that, but because you are exactly who you are. Who am I? You don't make excuses for things that don't need them. You don't wait for a round of applause just for doing the right thing. You put the kettle on in a stranger's kitchen like you belong there. You dust the books I left behind. And you show up on the first day of school because you made a promise to a 6-year-old. Not because it makes you look good. Sarah looked at him. Those aren't exactly rare qualities. In my experience they are, he said. From inside the school, a muffled bell rang out. Sophie was in there in a room with 25 other kids wearing her new sneakers, starting a new chapter. Mark, Sarah said quietly. I want you to know something. After April I thought a lot about what happened. Not about Ian or Ashley. That part one understood pretty quickly. I thought about why I didn't see the obvious for so long. She paused, choosing her words. I got used to only looking straight ahead. At the operating table, at the immediate task, at the next step. It's a useful skill in a hospital. Not always in life. And what did you decide that I need to learn how to look at the bigger picture? He paused. I'm still learning. Mark looked at her for a long time. The way he might study a blueprint that had just clicked into focus. I'm learning too, he said. 3 years is a long time to be alone. No. I'm not rushing you, he added. I know how to wait. I know you do. You stood against a wall in an ER hallway for 4 hours without sitting down. Sarah said something shifted in his face very faintly, almost imperceptibly, but she knew how to read those subtle shifts. Now the double doors swung open and kids began streaming out for recess. Sophie spotted them immediately and broke into a run. She skidded to a halt in front of them, grabbing both their hands again. We got our schedules, she announced. We have PE on Fridays. Is that good or bad? Depends on the gym teacher, Sarah said. If they're strict, it builds character. Sophie pondered this. Okay, I'm ready for character. She looked at her dad, then at Sarah. You're both still here. We're both here, Mark confirmed. Good, Sophie said, entirely devoid of melodrama. Let's go get pancakes. I'm starving. They walked down the suburban sidewalk. Sophie in the middle, still holding their hands, rambling about a girl in her class who wore a glittery headband. Sarah listened to her and thought back to April. Standing in the doorway of the country club, she had turned around to leave without having the slightest idea where she was going. What even happens after everything you thought was certain falls apart? Now she knew. What happens is a September morning, a little girl with a red cat backpack and a hand holding hers. What happens is a man walking beside you who knows how to wait and doesn't waste words. What happens is a kitchen where you know exactly which cabinet holds the coffee mugs, a bookshelf where you dusted the engineering texts and evening phone calls you actually look forward to. What happens is a life you didn't plan for, and because of that it is entirely real. Autumn progressed. Sarah worked long hours. The case load always spiked in the fall. Dr. Chambers finally gave her an independent or block schedule, cementing her status as a lead attending surgeon. It was a small but massive step. She spent more time in surgery than before, but it was a different kind of exhaustion. Not the kind that drained the marrow from her bones, but the kind that comes from doing your job well and knowing exactly why you're doing it. Natalie poured her coffee in the break room one morning and said, "You're different lately." My mom said the exact same thing. Sarah replied, "Moms usually notice the right things." Natalie set the mug down. "It's a good kind of different, you know." In October, Mark asked her to help pick out a winter coat for Sophie. It was funny and a little touching. A grown serious man who designed load-bearing structures for commercial high-rises was calling a trauma surgeon for advice on children's outerwear. Sarah didn't point out that she knew as much about kids' fashion as he did. She just said Saturday. On Saturday, the three of them went to the mall. Sophie evaluated coats with the rigor of a safety inspector. She squeezed the insulation, tested the zippers, and critically assessed the pockets. Pockets were a non-negotiable issue. "A pocket has to be big enough for important equipment," she explained to the abused sales associate. "What kind of equipment?" the teenager asked. "A rock, an acorn, a notebook, sometimes a frog, but that's situational." They settled on an olive green parka with massive cargo pockets. Sophie refused to take it off, marching out of the store, wearing it despite the heated mall air. "I think better in it," she explained. After shopping, they went to a diner. It was the same diner with the vinyl booths where Mark had taken her back in April. Sarah only realized it when she walked through the door. She recognized the window, the booze, the thick ceramic mugs. Mark had clearly not chosen it by accident. Sophie settled in with hot chocolate and a coloring book she pulled from her new pockets. Sarah and Mark ordered coffee and sat by the same window. Only now outside it was a crisp, windy October afternoon, not a bleak April drizzle. "Do you remember what happened here the first time?" Mark asked. "I remember you holding your mug with both hands and your fingers were shaking. That's just the adrenaline crash after an operation." "I told you that." "I know," he said. "I remember thinking that you were holding yourself together remarkably well for someone whose entire life had just blown up an hour earlier. What else was I supposed to do? Most people would have probably cried, yelled, or run to someone for sympathy. I didn't have anyone to run to for sympathy." "You came here," Mark said. "You drove me here." Was. "I'm glad I did." Sophie looked up from her coloring book. "What are you guys talking about April?" Mark said that was forever ago. Sophie stated logically, "It's October. You should talk about now." "Smart advice," Sarah agreed. "I know," Sophie said, returning to her crayons. Sarah looked out the window. Back in April, sitting right here, she had known absolutely nothing about the life she had now. She hadn't known about the house in the suburbs, the coffee mugs, the first day of school, the green parka, or the evening phone calls. Life doesn't ask if you're ready. It just grabs you by the hand, sometimes violently, sometimes gently, like Sophie on the playground, and pulls you forward. "Mark," Sarah said. "Yeah, I'm really glad you were at those doors." He looked at her. "Me too," he said. Simple, without unnecessary words. Exactly the way it needed to be said. November that year was strange in Chicago. Freezing dry one day, a mild thaw the next, leaving the streets gray and slick with sleet. Everyone walked around with a scowl, annoyed by the indecisive weather. But in that gloomy weather, Sarah felt a specific kind of clarity, as if the blurriness outside made everything inside sharper. She was driving home from a night shift at 7:30 a.m. when Mark called. "Morning. Morning. Just finished your shift." She had her phone on speaker on the dashboard. "Quiet night. Everything's fine. Sophie wanted me to tell you she got an A+ on her math test yesterday." "That's great news. Tell her I said congratulations." She demanded I tell you personally. She said you'd appreciate it. Why me? Because you're a person of logic. Her words. Sarah parked her car and turned off the engine. The cabin smelled faintly of old plastic and the stale coffee from her thermos. Mark, she said. Are you free tonight? A slight pause, the kind he made when he was smiling, but didn't want it to show in his voice. I'm free. I'll be there at 7 o'clock. She pulled into his driveway exactly at 7 o'clock. The house looked different in November. The apple tree was bare, the yard dormant, but warm yellow light spilled from the windows, making the house feel intensely alive. Sophie opened the front door before Sarah even knocked. She always heard the car pull up. Did you hear about my A+? Sophie demanded. I heard. Great job. It was a hard word problem about trains driving toward each other. You had to calculate where they'd meet. Sophie paused. I think it's a bad question. You shouldn't calculate where they meet, but if they want to UT philosophy, not math, Sarah pointed out. I know, Sophie agreed. But I still got an A. Mark was in the kitchen cooking at the stove. He turned around when Sarah walked in and gave her his usual short nod, but his eyes had that look, the look of a man who is deeply, quietly thrilled that you walked through his door. Dinner was simple. Soup, some crusty bread, leftovers from the day before. Sophie ate quickly, recounted a drama from the playground, and then announced she was going to bed because her organism required recovery, a phrase she had definitely stolen from Sarah. She marched upstairs. They were left alone at the kitchen table. Mark cleared the plates, sat back down, and looked at her steadily. The way a man looks when he made a decision a long time ago, and was only waiting for the exact right moment to say it. Sarah, he said. Yeah, I want to say something and I'm going to skip the preamble. She waited. I don't know how to give big speeches. He stated it as a fact. Not an apology. Never did. Irene used to joke that I expressed my feelings like a technical manual. He paused. But I'm going to say it how I know how, and I think you'll understand. She noticed his tone had shifted. It was completely stripped of any casual distance. I'm listening, she said. Mark folded his hands on the table. The same large, capable hands she remembered from the hospital hallway. You missed your own wedding because you were saving my daughter's life, he said slowly, as if setting each word down like a foundational brick. Afterward, you didn't ask for pity. You didn't complain. You moved, got an apartment, went right back to work. You came to see Sophie, not out of obligation but because you cared. You know where we keep the mugs in this kitchen. You dusted the books I left behind. You came on the first day of school because you made a promise. He paused. I watched all of that and I thought, this is a person I can trust with my life. Not because you're a great surgeon, but because of who you are. Sarah remained silent. I don't know what the official term for this is, Mark continued. But I know I want you here. Not in the apartment 2 blocks from the hospital. Here for real. The kitchen was so quiet she could hear the ticking of the wall clock in the hallway. Mark, Sarah said. Yeah, you said you didn't know the official term for it. She looked right at him. It's called a proposal. He stopped for a second. Yeah, he said. It's a proposal, just without the fancy restaurant and the poetic speeches because I don't know how to do that. I think I told you once that poetic speeches don't impress me. You did. Then the answer is yes, Sarah said. Just yes. He paused. I don't know how to do poetic speeches either. Something shifted in his face very faintly, but she knew exactly what it meant. He reached across the table and covered her hand with his firmly, briefly. The way you shake hands when a life-altering deal is struck. You realize Sophie is going to take full credit for this. He said. Well, she's not entirely wrong. Sarah replied. No, he agreed. She's not. They told Sophie the next morning over breakfast. She sat with her spoon suspended in midair, listening to the news with the expression of a manager receiving official confirmation of a project she had spearheaded months ago. Finally, she said. You're not surprised? Mark asked. No, Sophie stirred her oatmeal. I've been waiting. We're both a little slow, Mark offered. I figured this out at the cherry market, Sophie said. She looked at Sarah. So you're going to live here. Can I just call you Sarah? Carter takes too long to say you can. Sophie returned to her breakfast. Then it's settled. Mark bought the ring without Sarah. No hints, no guidance. A simple classic gold band. No massive diamond. He brought it home one evening and just placed it on the kitchen table next to her coffee mug without a velvet box. Try it on. See if it fits. She slipped it on. Perfect fit. How did you know my ring size? She asked. Tara. Sarah stared at him. Tara knows everything, Mark said. I've accepted it. They got married at the county courthouse in February. Not the historic estate with the columns and the jazz band. Just a municipal building. No frills. It was just the three of them plus 2 witnesses. Natalie for Sarah and Mark's college buddy Dave. Nancy flew in from out of town, bringing a homemade cherry pie. Specifically a pie, not a cake, and carried herself with the dignified air of a woman who knew things had finally been sorted out correctly. Sophie was the ring bearer. It was her own idea, and she treated the job with intense gravity. She had watched YouTube tutorials on the proper walking pace and practiced in the hallway using buttons. On the day of the ceremony, she carried the little pillow so solemnly that the county clerk, an older woman who had seen it all, gave her a genuinely warm smile. Kept it perfectly level. Sophie reported afterward. I didn't wobble once. We saw, Mark said. Outstanding work. It was a heavy responsibility, Sophie said. But I handled it. After the courthouse, they went to a small family-owned Italian place where Mark knew the owner. They had a private room in the back for the 10 of them. No DJ, no forced toasts, no extravagant centerpieces. Just good food, quiet conversation, and warmth. Natalie gave a short, precise toast to people who know how to do the right thing when it matters most. Dave told an embarrassing story about Mark in college, which provoked a rare, full laugh from Mark. Nancy didn't give a speech. She just sat next to Sarah, occasionally patting her hand, and that was enough. Sophie fell asleep in the car on the drive home, 10 minutes away from the house. Mark carried her up to her room, and she didn't even stir. She slept with the peaceful, utterly relaxed face of a child who knows her world is safe. Sarah stood in the doorway watching. Mark came back out into the hall and stood beside her. She's happy, he said quietly. You can tell. Sarah didn't have to think about it. Yeah, she said. I am too. Sarah officially moved out of the apartment and into the suburban house in March. She packed her 2 suitcases, the box of medical books and the geranium. She packed the structural engineering books in a separate box. Why are you packing those? Mark asked. They're mine. They're mine, he corrected. I left them there, which means you gifted them to me. He looked at her. The corners of his eyes crinkled. All right, he said. They're yours. The house with the apple tree accepted her without resistance, as if a space had always been left open for her. Sarah put the geranium on the kitchen windowsill where it caught the morning sun. She put her books on the shelf next to the engineering manuals. She hung her coat on the rack in the hallway, right next to Sophie's olive green parka. Sophie watched the unpacking process with scientific interest. You have a lot of books, she noted. I read fast. Me too. Will you read out loud to me if you want me to? Do. Sophie said. Dad reads good, but he skips the scary parts because he thinks I'm not ready. Am I not ready? Some of them. Probably not, but you should get to decide. That's fair. Sophie agreed. Deal. Spring came early to the Midwest that year. The apple tree bloomed by late April. White flowers, smelling of fresh earth, filling the whole yard. Sarah stepped out onto the porch one morning with her coffee, looked up and watched the petals drift in the wind. She thought about how exactly a year ago, she had been standing in the doorway of a country club in a cream-colored dress. A year is both a very short time and a very long time. Short because the days blur together. Long because in that time her entire previous life had faded into something resembling an old scar. You can see it if you look for it, but it doesn't hurt and it doesn't stop you from moving. From inside the house came Sophie's loud, clear voice. Dad, I can't find my eraser. Then Mark's calm reply. Check the side pocket of your backpack. Already looked. Look again. Found it. It was an ordinary morning. The exact kind of morning she had never known how to hope for because she hadn't known they existed. In the spring, Sarah realized she was pregnant. She didn't need a blood test to tell her. She just knew the way doctors who pay attention to bodies know their own. She took a pharmacy test in the doctor's lounge between 2 consults, looked at the 2 pink lines and stood in silence for a full minute. Then she called Mark. I'm heading home early, she said. I'll be there at 6. "'Kay," he said. "Did something happen?" "I'll tell you when I get home." She pulled into the driveway at 6 o'clock. Sophie was doing homework at the kitchen table. Mark was standing by the stove. Everything as usual. Sarah took off her jacket and hung it next to the green parka. "Sophie," she said, "do you want a brother or a sister?" Sophie stopped writing, looked up, and stared at Sarah with serious, calculating eyes. "Brother," she said. "A sister is competition. A brother is an assistant." Mark lowered his wooden spoon and turned around. Sarah looked at him. "A brother it is, I guess," she said. He walked over to her. He stopped and looked down at her with that steady, quiet gaze. She knew so well the one that needed no words because everything was already there. He took her hand. "'Kay," he said. "One word. Exactly the right one." Sophie slid off her chair and marched over. "When?" she demanded. "In the fall," Sarah said. "That's a long time. That's how biology works." Sophie considered this. "Fine." She walked back to her homework. "I'll start drawing portraits of him now so he gets used to us." Mark looked at Sarah. Sarah looked back. Neither of them said a word because there was nothing left to say. Everything was understood. The summer passed in a rhythm of work and the house in the suburbs. There was no conflict between the two. They walked side by side like 2 people who have found a matching stride. Sarah worked until August. Dr. Chambers didn't push her to step back, but didn't force her to stay either. She knew her own limits. In late August, she went on maternity leave. It was a bizarre new reality. No shifts, no 3 a.m. calls, no or adrenaline. Instead, there was the apple tree bearing heavy fruit. Sophie and her endless questions. Mark spreading blueprints over the table in the evenings. Long conversations about everything. His firm, her hospital, books, Sophie's latest theories, the future. Nancy came back in August, this time to stay for a while and help. She walked into the house, gave it her usual methodical inspection, nodded approvingly at the geranium in the window, and said to Mark, "That's a strong apple tree." It was her highest compliment. Mark understood perfectly. "Thank you, Nancy," he said. "You know how to listen," Nancy observed. "That's rare." After that, the 2 of them developed a habit of drinking coffee on the back deck in the mornings, sitting in companionable silence, as if they'd known each other for decades. Sarah watched them and thought that her mother had an uncanny ability to read people instantly, the way a good teacher knows who did the reading and who didn't. The second they opened their mouths, their son was born in October. The labor was long, 18 hours, finishing near dawn at the very hospital where Sarah worked. Dr. Peterson, the same anesthesiologist from Sophie's surgery, handled her epidural. Later he caught Mark in the hall and said, "Tough woman." Didn't complain once. Mark was by her side the entire 18 hours. He held her hand silently, calmly, exactly the way he had stood against the wall in the ER corridor. He didn't sit down even when the nurses offered him a chair. They named the boy Andrew. Sophie came to the hospital after school that same day, clutching a new drawing. It was her 3rd portrait, but this time there were 4 stick figures. 1 big, 1 slightly smaller, 1 kid-sized, and 1 tiny bundle. The caption read, "Us." "You can't see his fingers," Sophie explained, pointing to the tiny figure. "Because he's still small. I'll draw them later." "That's a sound strategy," Sarah said. "I know." Sophie pulled a chair up to the bassinet and peered over the plastic rim. She stared at Andrew for a long time, the way one studies a bizarre new artifact. "He's really small. Everyone starts out like that," Sarah said. You were that small once. Yeah, Sophie paused. And then you fixed me. I did. Sophie thought about it. That means you've been with us for a long time, she concluded. We just didn't know it yet. Sarah looked at Sophie, then looked up at Mark, who was standing by the window, listening. Yes, sir.